The scorching Arizona sun bore down mercilessly as Teresa Finch stumbled along the dusty trail, her infant son clutched desperately to her chest, each step becoming more laborious than the last. Her parched lips cracked as she tried to moisten them, the water canteen having run dry hours ago. The baby's whimpers grew weaker, matching her own dwindling strength as the unforgiving landscape of Camp Verde, Arizona seemed to stretch endlessly before her in the summer of 1883. Teresa's vision blurred as black spots danced at the edges. Her knees buckled, sending her down to one knee, still cradling her 6-month-old son Samuel protectively against her. The fever that had started 2 days prior now raged through her body, leaving her trembling despite the heat. She had been determined to make it to town for help after her husband's sudden death from snakebite 3 days ago at their remote homestead. But her illness and the brutal journey had depleted her reserves. "Just a little further, Sammy," she whispered hoarsely to her son, whose cherubic face was flushed from the heat. "Mama just needs to rest a moment." The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered in her fevered mind. Teresa tried to rise but found she couldn't summon the strength. The baby's cry grew more insistent as she slumped further to the ground, still fighting to stay conscious. "Madam, madam, are you all right?" The deep voice seemed to come from far away. Teresa forced her eyes open to see a tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His strong hands gently touched her shoulder. "Please," she managed, her voice barely audible. "My baby." "I've got you," the stranger said, kneeling beside her. "Both of you." Xavier Weston had been riding the boundary of his ranch when he spotted the woman and child. As a rancher who'd spent 5 years carving out his place in the harsh Arizona territory, he'd seen his share of tragedy, but the sight of the young mother clutching her infant stirred something deep within him. "Name's Xavier Weston," he said, carefully checking her for injuries. "My ranch is about 3 miles from here. Can you tell me your name, madam?" "Teresa," she whispered. "Teresa Finch. My boy is Samuel." Xavier touched her forehead and frowned at the heat radiating from her skin. "You're burning up with fever. What are you doing out here alone, my husband?" "Snake. 3 days ago," she managed before a coughing fit overtook her. The baby began to wail more loudly. Understanding the fragmented explanation, Xavier made a quick decision. "Mrs. Finch, I'm going to take you and your son to my ranch. You need water and medicine right away." When Teresa tried to stand, her legs gave out entirely. Without hesitation, Xavier gathered both mother and child into his arms. Teresa was so light, it frightened him. Clearly she'd gone without proper food and water for too long. The baby continued crying, but Xavier spoke soft, soothing words as he carefully mounted his horse, positioning Teresa and Samuel securely in front of him. "Hold on to your boy, Mrs. Finch." "I've got you both," he assured her, wrapping one strong arm around her waist while his other hand took the reins. "Just stay awake if you can." Teresa struggled to maintain consciousness as the horse set off at a gentle pace. She felt the solid strength of the stranger behind her, smelled leather and pine, and for the first time in days allowed herself to hope. Samuel's cries subsided as the rhythmic movement of the horse soothed him. "My ranch is just ahead," Xavier said, his voice rumbling near her ear. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, will know what to do for your fever. She's got healing hands, that woman." Teresa tried to respond, but darkness crowded her vision. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of being held securely as consciousness slipped away from her. When Teresa next opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar bed with clean sheets. The room was simple but comfortable, with a rocking chair near the window and a small table beside the bed. Panic seized her immediately. "Samuel," she called out, attempting to rise despite her weakness. The door opened, and an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun entered quickly. "There now, dear, your little one is just fine. Mr. Weston is minding him in the next room." Teresa sank back against the pillows, relief washing over her. "How long have I been asleep?" "Nearly 2 days," the woman replied, approaching with a cup of water. "I'm Edith Abernathy, Mr. Weston's housekeeper. You had a terrible fever, but it broke last night. You're still weak, though, so you must rest." Teresa gratefully accepted the water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "My baby, has he been fed?" "He needs, don't you worry," Mrs. Abernathy assured her. "We've been giving him cow's milk, watered down just right. He's taken to it well enough, though I suspect he'll be happier back with his mama." As if on cue, the door opened again, and Xavier entered, holding Samuel carefully in his large hands. The contrast between the rugged cowboy and the tiny infant might have been comical in other circumstances, but the gentle way he cradled the child revealed a natural tenderness that caught Teresa by surprise. "Look who's awake," Xavier said to the baby, his voice softening. "Your mama's finally back with us." Teresa reached out trembling arms, and Xavier carefully transferred Samuel to her. Tears welled in her eyes as she held her son close, inhaling his sweet scent. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Xavier. In the light of day, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin, keen hazel eyes, and a strong jawline softened somewhat by the smile that now touched his lips. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with streaks of silver just beginning to show in his dark brown hair at the temples. "No need for thanks, Mrs. Finch. Couldn't leave you both out there. Please call me Teresa." "Teresa," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "You gave us quite a scare. Dr. Pearson from town came out yesterday and said you were suffering from heat exhaustion and a nasty infection. He left medicine for you." Teresa looked down at her son, who was contentedly playing with a strand of her hair. "I don't know how I can repay your kindness, Mr. Weston." "Xavier," he corrected with a slight smile, "and there's no debt. Anyone would have done the same." But Teresa knew that wasn't true. In the harsh reality of frontier life, not everyone would take in strangers, especially a sick woman and a baby who could only be burdens. "I should be well enough to travel soon," she said, though the thought of leaving the safety of this place filled her with dread. "I was trying to reach Camp Verde when you found me." Xavier exchanged a glance with Mrs. Abernathy. "You'll stay until you're fully recovered," he said firmly. "Doctor's orders. Besides, Camp Verde is still a good 15 miles from where I found you. You have family there." Teresa shook her head. "No, but I thought I might find work. After James, my husband, died, I couldn't stay at our homestead alone." She swallowed hard. "We were trying to make a go of farming, but it was already failing before the snake got him. I don't have anywhere else to go." The room fell silent except for Samuel's soft cooing. Xavier's expression was unreadable for a moment before he nodded decisively. "You'll stay here until you've regained your strength and figured out your next steps. No arguments." His tone brooked no opposition. "My ranch is short-handed anyway. Mrs. Abernathy could use help with the household when you're well enough." "I couldn't possibly." "You could and you will," Mrs. Abernathy interjected kindly but firmly. "I'm not as young as I once was, and this place could use a woman's touch beyond what these old hands can provide." Xavier cleared his throat. "It's settled then. You rest and recover. We'll talk more when you're stronger." With that, he excused himself, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. Mrs. Abernathy patted Teresa's hand. "He's a good man," the older woman said. "Lost his wife and daughter to typhoid 5 years ago, just after they settled this ranch. Hasn't been the same since, but he's fair and honest." Teresa looked down at Samuel, who had drifted to sleep in her arms. "I'm sorry for his loss. Life out here takes as much as it gives, Mrs. Abernathy said philosophically. "Now, can I bring you some broth? You need to build your strength." Over the next week, Teresa gradually recovered her strength. She began helping with small tasks around the house, folding laundry, preparing vegetables for meals, and caring for Samuel, who had become a favorite with everyone at the ranch, including the 3 cowboys who worked for Xavier. Xavier himself was often busy with ranch work during the days, but he made a point to check on Teresa and Samuel each evening. At first, their conversations were brief and somewhat awkward, but gradually they became more comfortable with each other. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Teresa sat on the front porch in a rocking chair, Samuel sleeping in a makeshift cradle beside her. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber hues, and a gentle breeze provided relief from the day's heat. Xavier emerged from the barn and, seeing her on the porch, approached and leaned against the railing. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better," Teresa replied. "Mrs. Abernathy says I'm finally getting some color back in my cheeks." "She's right," Xavier agreed, studying her face. Teresa felt a flutter in her chest under his gaze. "I've been meaning to ask," he continued, "what made you and your husband choose to homestead in such isolated country? It's rough land, especially for farming." Teresa sighed, looking out at the horizon. "It wasn't really a choice. James had a dream of having his own land, and that parcel was what he could afford. We came from Missouri last year, hoping for a fresh start." She paused, remembering. He was a good man, but stubborn. Wouldn't listen when folks told him that patch was too dry for crops. Xavier nodded, understanding. "The Arizona Territory breaks many dreams that way. You need to understand the land to work with it, not against it. I tried to tell him we should raise goats instead of trying to grow wheat, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of her dead husband. "He didn't listen to his wife's good sense," Xavier finished for her, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Men can be fools that way." Teresa couldn't help but return his smile. "And are you such a fool, Mr. Weston?" "Xavier," he reminded her. "And I'd like to think I've learned a thing or two about listening. My Kathleen, my late wife, she taught me that lesson well." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sunset. Samuel stirred and made a small sound, and Xavier glanced at the baby with undisguised affection. "He's growing stronger every day," Xavier observed. "Got a good pair of lungs on him, too. Heard him all the way at the corral yesterday." Teresa laughed softly. "Yes, he makes his opinions known. Thank you for not minding the noise." "It's good to hear a child's voice around here again," Xavier said, his voice growing distant for a moment. Then, as if catching himself in melancholy, he straightened. "I've got some business in Camp Verde tomorrow. Is there anything you need from town?" Teresa hesitated. "Actually, I should probably go with you. I need to see about finding more permanent arrangements. I've imposed on your hospitality too long already." Xavier's expression darkened. "You're not imposing, Teresa, and you're still recovering." "It's been over 2 weeks," she pointed out gently. "I'm much stronger now, and I need to face reality. Samuel and I can't stay here indefinitely." "Why not?" The question came abruptly, surprising them both. Teresa blinked at him, unsure how to respond. Because this is your home, not ours." Xavier pushed away from the railing and paced a few steps before turning back to her. The offer of work was genuine. "Mrs. Abernathy isn't getting any younger, and the men and I could use decent meals and a properly kept house." He ran a hand through his hair, seeming uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "You'd have your own quarters, fair wages, and Samuel would have space to grow. at least until you decide what you really want to do." Teresa studied him, trying to understand the man behind the offer. Was it merely kindness, or something more? She couldn't deny that she'd grown comfortable here, that the thought of leaving filled her with anxiety. But she also couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest whenever Xavier entered a room, the way his smile seemed to warm her from within. Such feelings for a man she barely knew so soon after losing James confused and frightened her. "I'll consider it," she finally said. "But I should still go to town with you tomorrow. I need fabric for new clothes for Samuel, and I should at least see what opportunities might exist there." Xavier nodded, seeming relieved she hadn't outright refused. "We'll leave after breakfast then. The ride takes about 2 hours. As he bid her good night and walked toward the bunkhouse where he'd been sleeping since giving Teresa his bedroom, she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake by even considering staying. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a man who might only see her as a charity case or a convenient housekeeper. Yet as she gathered Samuel and went inside, Teresa couldn't deny the sense of rightness she felt on this ranch, with its sweeping views and simple, honest way of life. For the first time since James's death, she felt safe, and for a woman alone in the West with an infant son, safety was no small consideration. The following morning dawned clear and already warm. Teresa dressed in her only decent dress, washed and mended by Mrs. Abernathy, and prepared Samuel for the journey. Xavier had arranged for them to travel in a small wagon rather than on horseback, making the trip more comfortable for Teresa and the baby. As they set out, the ranch spread behind them, a modest but well-maintained collection of buildings nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. 200 head of cattle grazed on the surrounding grasslands, tended by Xavier's cowhands. "You've built something impressive here," Teresa remarked as Xavier guided the horses along the rough trail. "How long have you been in Arizona?" "Going on 6 years now," Xavier replied, his eyes scanning the horizon habitually. "Came from Texas with Kathleen and our daughter Emma. She was just 4 when we arrived." A shadow crossed his face at the mention of his family. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you lost them to typhoid," Teresa said softly. "I'm sorry." Xavier nodded, his jawline tightening. "A year after we settled, the doctor couldn't do anything for them." "That's why," he paused, glancing at her. "That's part of why I couldn't just ride past when I found you and Samuel, seeing you so ill with your child." Teresa understood then some of his motivation in helping them. It must have brought back painful memories. "Yes, but it also gave me a chance to do something I couldn't do for them." His hands tightened on the reins. "Anyway, that's in the past. I've built a good operation here. Not the biggest ranch in the territory, but it's profitable enough." They talked easily as they traveled, Xavier pointing out landmarks and telling stories of the area. Teresa found herself laughing at his dry humor and feeling increasingly at ease in his company. Samuel, secured in a sling across Teresa's chest, seemed content with the motion of the wagon and the sound of their voices. Camp Verde revealed itself as a small but bustling town with a main street lined with businesses, a general store, saloon, hotel, blacksmith, and various other establishments. People moved about their business, some on horseback, others on foot. The sound of piano music drifted from the saloon despite the early hour. "Town's grown some since I was last here," Teresa observed. "James and I passed through on our way to the homestead." Xavier guided the wagon to a hitching post outside the general store. Camp Verde's becoming an important stop between Prescott and Phoenix. The army post brings in business too. As Xavier helped Teresa down from the wagon, a well-dressed man approached them, his expression brightening in recognition. "Xavier Weston, haven't seen you in town for a spell." The man's curious gaze shifted to Teresa and Samuel. "George," Xavier greeted him with a nod. "Been busy at the ranch." "This is Mrs. Teresa Finch and her son Samuel. Teresa, this is George Holbrook, owns the bank here in town." Teresa nodded politely, conscious of her simple dress and the curious glances from passers-by. In a small town like Camp Verde, a woman and child appearing with the widowed rancher was bound to cause talk. "Pleasure, madam," George said, tipping his hat. "New to these parts. Mrs. Finch's husband recently passed," Xavier explained briefly. "She's been recuperating at my ranch after falling ill on the trail." Understanding dawned in George's eyes. "My condolences, Mrs. Finch. If there's anything the town can do to assist you, you let us know." "Thank you, Mr. Holbrook," Teresa replied. "Actually, I was hoping to inquire about any work opportunities in town. I'm a skilled seamstress, and I can read and write well enough to keep books." George looked thoughtful. "Well now, Mrs. Monroe at the hotel was just saying she needs help with linens and such. And I believe the schoolteacher, Miss Perkins, was looking for an assistant." He glanced at Samuel. "Though with a little one that might be difficult." Xavier's expression remained neutral, but Teresa noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "We should see to our errands," he said. "Good day, George." Inside the general store, Teresa selected fabric for baby clothes and a few necessities, while Xavier arranged for supplies to be loaded into the wagon. The store owner's wife, Mrs. Bailey, cooed over Samuel and offered Teresa advice about the town. "Camp Verde's growing, but it can be rough," the older woman said in a hushed tone. "Not the easiest place for a woman alone with a child. The Weston Ranch is a good place, from what I hear. Xavier's a respected man in these parts." Teresa nodded noncommittally, uncomfortable with the woman's probing curiosity. "Mr. Weston has been very kind." Mrs. Bailey's knowing smile suggested she was drawing her own conclusions. "He's been alone too long, if you ask me. A man needs a woman's touch, especially out on a ranch like that." Teresa felt her cheeks warm. "We should probably finish our shopping," she said, effectively ending the conversation. As they continued their errands around town, Teresa became increasingly aware of the challenges she would face if she chose to settle in Camp Verde. The hotel job would require long hours and wouldn't allow her to keep Samuel with her. The teaching assistant position was already filled, according to Miss Perkins when they stopped by the schoolhouse. Other opportunities seemed similarly limited or impractical for a woman with an infant. By midday, they stopped at a small cafe for lunch. Xavier had been quietly supportive throughout the morning, neither encouraging nor discouraging Teresa's inquiries about work. As they sat with their meals, Samuel sleeping in Teresa's arms, Xavier finally broke his silence on the matter. "Seems like options are limited in town," he observed, watching her face carefully. Teresa sighed. "Yes, I hadn't really considered how difficult it would be with Samuel." She stroked her son's soft cheek. "I can't leave him with strangers all day, and I can't work while caring for him." "My offer still stands," Xavier said quietly. "The ranch is a good place to raise a child. Open air, space to run, animals to learn from. Emma loved it there for the short time she had." Teresa met his gaze. "Why are you doing this, Xavier? Truly, is it because I remind you of your wife?" "Because you couldn't save her and your daughter." The directness of her question seemed to startle him, but after a moment he answered honestly. "Maybe that was part of it at first, but no, you don't remind me of Kathleen. She was different city bred, never quite adjusted to ranch life." He paused. "You're stronger than you know, Teresa. The way you fought to keep going for your son's sake, even when you were at the end of your strength, that takes a special kind of courage." His words touched something deep within her. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of making the wrong choice for Samuel. Afraid of She hesitated. "Of what?" Xavier prompted gently. "Of coming to depend on you only to find myself alone again," Teresa whispered, surprised by her own honesty. Xavier's expression softened. "I can't promise what the future holds, Teresa. None of us can out here, but I can promise you won't be turned out, no matter what. The position at the ranch is yours for as long as you want it, with no strings attached." Something in his steady gaze told Teresa he meant every word. After a moment, she nodded. "Then we accept, at least for now. Thank you." Relief flickered across his features, quickly masked. "Good. That's settled then." They finished their meal and completed the last of their errands before starting the journey back to the ranch. As they traveled, Teresa felt a curious mix of emotions: uncertainty about her decision, yet also a sense of rightness that she couldn't explain. Xavier was still largely a mystery to her, but she trusted him in a way that defied logical explanation. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, painting the landscape in warm, golden light. Mrs. Abernathy greeted them at the door, her expression brightening when Teresa informed her they would be staying. "Oh, thank heavens!" the older woman exclaimed. "I've already grown so fond of this little man." She tickled Samuel under his chin, eliciting a toothless grin. "And it'll do Xavier good to have some youth around the place again." That evening, as Teresa settled Samuel in the cradle Xavier had built for him, she found herself thinking about the path that had led her here. Just weeks ago, she had been desperate and dying, convinced her life and her sons were forfeit to the harsh realities of frontier existence. Now, she had shelter, security, and perhaps the beginnings of something she hadn't dared to hope for: a new home. As summer progressed into fall, Teresa found her place at the Weston Ranch. She took over much of the household management from Mrs. Abernathy, who was grateful to focus on cooking and gardening rather than the heavier work. Teresa's skills as a seamstress came in handy for mending and making clothing for everyone on the ranch, and she even began to learn basic bookkeeping to help Xavier with the ranch accounts. The three cowboys who worked for Xavier: Hank, a grizzled veteran of the frontier; Joe, a young man eager to prove himself; and Miguel, a skilled horseman from Mexico, became like uncles to Samuel, bringing him little treasures from their rides and competing for his smiles and laughter. Xavier remained somewhat reserved, but Teresa noticed he sought her company more frequently. They fell into a pattern of sitting on the porch in the evenings after supper, watching the sunset while Samuel played on a blanket at their feet. These quiet moments became precious to Teresa, a time when they could talk freely about their days, their pasts, and occasionally, cautiously, about the future. One crisp October evening, as they sat watching the fiery sunset, Xavier broached a subject he'd clearly been considering for some time. "Winter will be here before we know it," he began, watching Samuel, who was now crawling with determined energy across the porch. "The north bedroom gets the morning sun. It would be warmer for you and Samuel than the room you're in now." Teresa glanced at him, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. "That's your bedroom, Xavier," he shrugged. "I've gotten used to the bunkhouse, but it occurred to me that it doesn't make sense for the master of the house to sleep there while guests take the main house." "Are we still guests?" Teresa asked softly. Xavier met her gaze directly. "You know you're more than that, Teresa. You've made this place a home again." The admission hung between them, weighted with unspoken feelings. Teresa had come to recognize that what she felt for Xavier was growing beyond gratitude or friendship, but she had been careful to keep those emotions guarded. Now, she wondered if he might share them. "I don't want to displace you from your home," she said. "You wouldn't be," Xavier replied. "In fact, I've been thinking that the house needs some changes. It was built for a family, not a bachelor rancher." He hesitated. If you're planning to stay longer term, perhaps you could help me decide what improvements would make it more suitable. Teresa's heart quickened at the implication. Longer term, Xavier looked away, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. I don't mean to presume or to rush you. I know it's only been a few months since your husband passed. 4 months, Teresa acknowledged, and while I mourned James, our marriage was not what I had hoped for. She rarely spoke of her late husband, but felt Xavier deserved her honesty. He was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity, the next scheme. He wasn't unkind, but he wasn't practical either. I spent most of our marriage worrying about how we would eat. Xavier nodded, understanding. Life out here requires both dreams and practicality. Too much of either is dangerous. Yes, Teresa agreed, smiling slightly. You seem to have found that balance. They fell silent, watching as Samuel pulled himself up using the porch railing, wobbling precariously on his little legs. Xavier instinctively moved closer, ready to catch the baby if he fell. He'll be walking before we know it, Xavier observed with evident affection. And talking too. Time passes quickly with little ones. Teresa watched the interaction, her heart full. Over these months, Xavier had become increasingly attached to Samuel, and the baby clearly adored him in return, lighting up whenever the rancher entered the room. It was becoming harder to imagine a future that didn't include Xavier in their lives. I think the north bedroom would be perfect for winter, she said finally, but only if you return to the main house as well. The bunkhouse is no place for you, especially during cold weather. Xavier looked at her sharply, perhaps catching the meaning beneath her words. Teresa, I'm not suggesting anything improper, she clarified quickly. But this is your home, Xavier. You shouldn't be exiled from it because of our presence. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'll move back to the house. As they settled into this new arrangement, Teresa became increasingly aware of Xavier's presence in the house, the sound of his boots in the hallway, his deep voice giving instructions to the cowboys, the scent of leather and tobacco that lingered after he passed through a room. They maintained appropriate distance and behavior, especially in front of the ranch hands and Mrs. Abernathy, but there was an undeniable tension growing between them. November brought the first real cold snap, with frost covering the ground each morning. The ranch work changed with the season. Cattle needed extra feed, buildings required winterizing, and firewood became a daily concern. Teresa kept the house warm and welcoming, developing new recipes to tempt the appetites of the hard-working men. Samuel celebrated his first birthday with a small party that brought unexpected joy to everyone at the ranch. Xavier presented the boy with a hand-carved wooden horse, detailed with remarkable skill. When Teresa expressed surprise at his craftsmanship, Xavier admitted that woodworking had been a hobby he'd abandoned after his family's deaths. It felt good to make something again, he told her as they watched Samuel play with his new toy. To create instead of just maintain. Teresa understood completely. She had felt the same way as she rebuilt her life at the ranch, creating something new from the ashes of what had been lost. As Thanksgiving approached, Xavier announced that they would host a gathering for neighboring ranchers and townsfolk, something that apparently had been tradition before his wife and daughter died, but which he had discontinued in his grief. It's time this place saw some celebration again, he told Teresa when she expressed surprise at the sudden sociability. If you're willing to help with the preparations. Of course, she agreed, though she felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of being presented to the community. What would people think of her position at the ranch? Would they assume impropriety? Xavier seemed to read her concerns. Everyone will understand you're Samuel's mother and my housekeeper, he assured her. Though I hope you know you've become far more than that to this ranch. And to me. The simple statement, delivered with quiet sincerity, brought a blush to Teresa's cheeks. "And you to us," she replied softly. The Thanksgiving gathering proved to be a turning point. 20 guests filled the Weston ranch house, neighboring ranchers and their wives. The doctor from Camp Verde and his family, the pastor and his wife, and a few trusted friends. The house rang with conversation and laughter, smelled of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie, and felt truly alive for the first time in years, according to Mrs. Abernathy. Teresa found herself warmly welcomed by most of the guests, though she noted a few speculative glances and whispered conversations. She did her best to focus on being a good hostess rather than worrying about gossip. During the meal, Pastor Williams asked for everyone's attention. "Before we enjoy this bounty, I'd like to invite each person to share something they're thankful for this year." When Xavier's turn came, he cleared his throat and spoke with quiet conviction. "I'm thankful that God saw fit to put Mrs. Finch and her son in my path when they needed help. They've brought life back to this ranch, and for that, I'm deeply grateful." His gaze met Teresa's across the table, and the naked emotion there made her breath catch. Several of the guests exchanged knowing looks, but Teresa barely noticed, too caught up in the realization that Xavier's feelings might indeed match her own growing attachment. After the guests departed and Samuel was tucked into bed, Teresa found Xavier on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She joined him, drawing her shawl tighter against the chill. "Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves," she said. Xavier nodded. "Best Thanksgiving this place has seen in years. You have a gift for making people feel welcome, Teresa. It's easy when they are as kind as your friends." He turned to face her. "Most of them, anyway. I noticed Mrs. Prescott making her opinions known to anyone who would listen." Teresa smiled ruefully. "Yes, she made a point of asking me very loudly about my living arrangements here." Xavier's expression darkened. "I should have said something to her." "No need. Mrs. Abernathy handled it beautifully. Told her that some women focus on propriety to distract from their own unhappy marriages." Teresa chuckled at the memory. Poor Mrs. Prescott turned quite red. Xavier laughed, a full, rich sound that Teresa had rarely heard from him. "I've always said Mrs. Abernathy is worth her weight in gold." They fell into comfortable silence, standing close enough that Teresa could feel the warmth emanating from him. Finally, Xavier spoke again, his voice lower. "Teresa, I want to be clear about something. I value your presence here, yours and Samuel's, more than I can say. But I don't want you to ever feel obligated to stay because of what I've provided." Teresa turned to face him fully. "Is that what you think, that I stay out of obligation?" "I don't know why you stay," he admitted. "You're capable, intelligent, you could make a life elsewhere if you chose to." "I stay because I want to be here," Teresa said firmly, "because Samuel is thriving, because the ranch feels like home now." She hesitated, gathering her courage. "And because of you, Xavier." His eyes widened slightly. "Me?" "Yes, you," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "You, who carried Samuel and me when we had no strength left. You, who gave us shelter without asking anything in return. You, who treats my son as if he were your own." She took a deep breath. "You, who I've grown to care for more than I thought possible." Xavier stood perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. "Teresa, I've been fighting my feelings for you, believing it was too soon after your husband's death, that you might feel pressured or obligated." "I mourn James," Teresa said quietly. "But what I feel for you is entirely different. It's stronger, deeper than anything I felt for him. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself." Slowly, cautiously, Xavier reached out to take her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "I never thought I'd feel this way again after Kathleen died. I'd resign myself to loneliness. Teresa squeezed his hand. Neither of us has to be alone anymore. Xavier's free hand came up to gently touch her cheek. May I kiss you, Teresa? Her heart pounding, Teresa nodded. Xavier leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle yet charged with emotion. Teresa responded, allowing herself to fully acknowledge the feelings that had been growing for months. When they finally parted, Xavier kept her close, their foreheads touching. I love you, Teresa Finch, he whispered. You and Samuel both. I want you to stay not as my housekeeper but as my wife if you'll have me. Tears welled in Teresa's eyes. Are you certain? It's a big responsibility taking on another man's wife and child. Xavier shook his head. That's not how I see it. I see a woman of extraordinary courage and a boy who deserves every chance at a good life. I see a family I want to build with you. Teresa's heart overflowed with emotion. Then yes, Xavier Weston, I will marry you. Their second kiss sealed the promise, longer and deeper than the first, filled with hope for the future they would create together. 2 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, Teresa Finch became Teresa Weston in a simple ceremony performed by Pastor Williams in the ranch house parlor. Samuel, now taking his first unsteady steps, was held by Mrs. Abernathy, who wept openly throughout the service. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, uncomfortably formal in their Sunday best, but genuinely happy for their boss and the woman who had brought warmth back to the ranch. Xavier had insisted on doing things properly, riding into Camp Verde to speak with Judge Parker about legally adopting Samuel after the wedding. The judge, impressed by Xavier's determination to give the boy his name and inheritance rights, agreed to process the paperwork swiftly. After a small celebration with their ranch family, Xavier took Teresa and Samuel on a tour of the property in the wagon, showing them boundaries and features Teresa had never seen during her months there. I want you to understand what you're part of now, he explained as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the ranch lands. This isn't just my property anymore, it's ours, yours and Samuel's as much as mine. Teresa, Samuel secure in her lap, took in the expansive view, rolling grasslands where cattle grazed, the creek that provided water year-round, distant mountains purple against the horizon, and at the center, the cluster of buildings that made up the ranch headquarters, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney of what was now truly her home. It's beautiful, she said sincerely, and more than I ever dreamed of having again when you found us on that trail. Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders. I think about that day often, how close I came to not riding that boundary line, how easily I might have missed you. But you didn't, Teresa reminded him, leaning into his strength. You found us when we needed you most, and you brought me back to life when I didn't even realize how dead inside I'd become, Xavier replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. I'd say we found each other. As they made their way back to the ranch house, Teresa reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the desperate trek that nearly claimed their lives, the strong arms that had carried them to safety, and the love that had grown steadily in the aftermath. What had begun as a rescue had transformed into something far more profound, a second chance at happiness for all of them. That night, after putting Samuel to bed in what was now officially his room, Teresa joined Xavier in their bedroom, the master bedroom she had once refused to displace him from. As husband and wife, they discovered each other with tenderness and growing passion, the final barrier between them dissolving as they committed fully to their shared future. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Xavier's arms, Teresa whispered, "Thank you for carrying us home that day." Xavier's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for becoming my home." Spring arrived with renewal and promise. The ranch thrived under their joint care, Xavier managing the cattle and land, Teresa overseeing the household and keeping the books. Samuel grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed Papa adoringly around the ranch whenever permitted. Xavier took his role as adoptive father seriously, already teaching the boy about horses and cattle with infinite patience. In April, Teresa shared joyful news with her husband they were expecting a child of their own, due in late autumn. Xavier's response was to lift her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, his face alight with happiness. "Are you pleased?" Teresa asked needlessly, laughing as he set her down. "More than I can say," Xavier replied, his hand gently covering her still flat stomach. "Samuel will have a brother or sister. Our family is growing." Teresa covered his hand with her own. "Our family," she repeated, savoring the words. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed in less than a year. For the better, beyond anything I could have imagined." As her pregnancy progressed, Teresa bloomed with health and happiness. Unlike her difficult pregnancy with Samuel during lean times with James, this child grew within her under conditions of plenty and peace. Xavier was attentive without being overbearing, making sure she rested when needed while encouraging her independence. In late October, with Mrs. Abernathy and the doctor in attendance, Teresa gave birth to a healthy son they named William Xavier Weston. Samuel, now nearly 2 years old, regarded his new brother with a mixture of curiosity and caution, gradually warming to the role of big brother under Xavier's gentle guidance. "2 sons," Xavier marveled as he held William while Samuel leaned against his knee. "More than I ever hoped for." Teresa, resting in their bed, watched the 3 males of her family with a heart so full it threatened to overflow. "They'll grow up strong and good like their father." Xavier's eyes met hers over the baby's head. "And wise and kind, like their mother." 3 years later, the Weston Ranch had expanded in both land and family. A daughter, Emma Kathleen, joined the family, named for the daughter Xavier had lost, and the wife Teresa had come to respect through Xavier's stories. Samuel, now 5, was a responsible older brother who helped care for 3-year-old William and baby Emma with surprising gentleness for such an energetic boy. The ranch prospered under Xavier's management and Teresa's careful accounting. They had added a second story to the house to accommodate their growing family, and the once bachelor ranch now boasted a thriving kitchen garden, a small orchard, and even a few dairy cows, Teresa's special project. On the 5th anniversary of the day Xavier had found Teresa and Samuel on the trail, the family took a special ride together. Xavier carried Emma securely before him on his horse, while Teresa rode her own mare with William, and Samuel proudly rode his pony alongside. They traveled to the spot where their story had begun, the place where Teresa had collapsed with Samuel in her arms, where Xavier had found them and made the decision that would change all their lives. "It doesn't look special," Samuel observed, looking around at the ordinary stretch of trail. "Just rocks and dirt," Xavier smiled. "Sometimes the most important places don't look special to others, but they are to us. This is where Papa found us when we were in trouble," Teresa explained to the children. "I was sick and couldn't carry your brother Samuel any further. Papa carried us both all the way to the ranch." "Like when you carry me when I'm tired?" William asked Xavier. "Just like that," Xavier confirmed. "Except your mama and brother were strangers to me then." "But not anymore," Samuel stated with the confidence of a child who knew he was deeply loved. "No, not anymore," Xavier agreed, reaching over to ruffle the boy's hair. "Now you're my son, as surely as if you'd been born to me." Teresa felt tears prick her eyes at the simple truth of his words. Xavier had never once treated Samuel differently than their biological children, never once reminded the boy that he wasn't his natural father. In every way that mattered, they were father and son. "Why are you crying, Mama?" Samuel asked, noticing her tears. "Because I'm happy," Teresa explained. "Sometimes people cry when they are very, very happy." "That's silly," William declared, making them all laugh. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Xavier drew his horse alongside Teresa's. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, so the children couldn't hear. Teresa looked at him at the lines of responsibility and laughter etched around his eyes, the strength in his hands as he held their daughter, the love in his gaze as it rested on her, and shook her head. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Every step of the journey, even the hardest ones, led us here. How could I regret that?" Xavier leaned over to kiss her briefly, igniting the same spark that had never dimmed between them. "Race you home," Teresa laughed. "With the children, we'll go slow," he promised with a wink. "Last one back makes coffee in the morning." As they rode toward home, the children giggling with excitement at the game, Teresa's heart swelled with gratitude. 5 years ago, she had been at the end of her strength, certain that she and Samuel would die on that lonely trail. Instead, they had found not just rescue but redemption, not just shelter but love. The Weston Ranch spread before them, a testament to what could be built with determination, hard work, and love. And as they approached, Teresa knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged, with this man who had carried her and her son when they couldn't walk alone, with these children who filled their days with joy and purpose, in this place that had become the home of her heart. The day Xavier Weston carried Teresa and Samuel Finch to safety became the foundation of a legacy that would endure through generations, a family built not just on blood but on choice, on commitment, and on a love strong enough to overcome the harshest challenges of frontier life. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the landscape in golden light, the Weston family rode the final stretch toward home together, as they would remain through all the seasons of their lives.